Welcome again to Shoe Leather Faith. My name's Robert McMillan, and we're going to delve into a subject that I've been kind of dreading for some time. And it's not that it's so much a difficult subject. The fact is, it's a pretty much rejected subject. I call it Me, Obey Him, and it deals with submission within marriage. And we're going to deal specifically with 1 Peter 3 verse 7. And I want you to remember that there's only one unquestionable source for truth. That's in this book, the Bible. I'm going to give you my best shot at it, but as I said last time, I'm hoping that you will help me and put comments down below as to whether or not I'm on target or missed it by a mile, or I gave you something to think about, or maybe you have something for me to think about. But the issue of submission within marriage and the issue of hierarchies within the family are tough issues to deal with. Turn in your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Wives likewise. Now what's the likewise there for? Well, it goes back to verse 13 of the previous chapter. Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. Okay, there's the start of this whole statement about submission. Start off, you submit to rulers. And by the way, Peter here wasn't talking about nice rulers. He was talking about people like Caligula, the emperor, or Nero, the emperor, the one who executed Paul, and probably executed him as well. And in the same way we're supposed to submit to government and give honor to the king. Look at verse 17. Honor all people. In other words, ascribe value to them. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. That fear God is going to carry throughout this section. In our day, that's been thrown under the bus. End of summer of 2018, and we're seeing disgraceful displays of nastiness, not just in government, not just in Congress or the Senate or in the administration in the White House, but everybody's becoming nasty. So we're swimming upstream if we're looking at issues of honoring or ascribing value to people who may or may not deserve it. And then it goes in verse 18 of chapter 2 to servants. This is, by the way, this is house servants or house slaves, if you will. Not the normal word for slaves. This is not doulos, but it's another word. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear. Then we move up to chapter 3, verse 1. Wives likewise. In the same way I'm telling you to submit and honor and show respect for or ascribe value to the king and to the masters, even if they don't deserve it. Wives likewise be submissive to your own husband, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. Realize that that passage is saying wives are submit to their own husbands. Not all women submit to all men. And by the way, the concept of a submissive wife is practically alien to our society. Hierarchy is today considered a dirty word. I have used the word hierarchy, and it's as if I said something filthy. It's a good word, it's a normal word, and there are hierarchies. There's hierarchy within the Godhead. I don't want to get into that right now, but someday I may do a series on how God works together with the three persons, but not right now. Women who work outside of the home are susceptible to independence. And that independence causes them to be independent of their husbands, whom they should follow. The only way to assure a secure love relationship within the family is for the wife to place herself under the headship of her husband, and for her husband to accept his responsibility of providing humble servant leadership for his wife and family, and that motivated by love. If you have all those things in place, nobody will have a problem with submission. Now I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3, and we're going to read something for a minute. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ. Okay, there's a flat statement. Every man, and it's not talking about husbands, it will in a minute, but right now, every man is subject to Christ. He's to submit to Christ in everything. The head of woman, literally the wife, is man, or literally the husband. And the head of Christ is God. So there's a hierarchy. And the only way the marriage relationship will function is if both husband and wife are in submission to God. Please note that the text is not stating that all women are to submit to all men. The ultimate authority for the wife is God himself. And the subordinate authority is her husband. Here's how it works. When I was drafted into the Army, I was apparently under the authority of the President of the United States. He didn't know who I was, even though I knew who he was. When the general said something, the captain followed up, the lieutenant followed up, and some sergeant followed up, and I jumped. Why? Because the sergeant said jump, and the lieutenant told him to jump, and everybody was told to jump all the way back up to the President of the United States. These are all subordinate authorities. And these subordinate authorities were all answerable in the military to the President of the United States. In the family, everyone is answerable to God. Men, if you don't treat your wives right, you're answerable to God. Women, wives, if you don't submit to your husband and follow his leadership and respect him, you're answerable to God. Submission is a necessary thing, and it's a military term, to place yourself under. In Ephesians 5:24 it says, "Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their husbands," their own husband, by the way, "in everything." Submission is the result of God's command, and it's right there in Ephesians 5:24. If you don't want to obey your husband, you don't have to explain it to me, but you're going to have to explain it to God why you didn't think he was serious about Ephesians 5:24. Submission was also built into the creation hierarchy. Evidence for hierarchy between the man and his wife is clear before the fall due to the theological concept of the federal headship. How does that work? God made man, and he made the woman from man. In other words, she had life from him. The husband, the man, Adam, had life directly from God. And it's been that way ever since. Adam is our federal head. He was responsible for everything. Don't you think it's odd, in a way, that Eve was not found guilty of eating the fruit? The accusation came to Adam. When God gave the instruction not to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, Eve hadn't even been created yet. Just Adam. And the instruction was to Adam. So the fall is wholly upon the shoulders of Adam, not Eve. Otherwise, Eve couldn't be saved. If she sinned first and Jesus died for the sins of Adam, poor Eve's left out, isn't she? Adam is the federal head, and that means that he brought us all down when he listened to his wife, stepped out from under the authority of God and stepped under the authority of his wife. After the fall, submission was reinforced by a rule. The second consequence of Genesis 3:16 talks about the obedience of the wife to her husband. Your desire shall be for him to rule over him, but he shall rule over you. So what was started in the garden in perfection in paradise as a delight to Eve became a command to Eve. Obey your husband. The implication of Genesis 3:16 is that the desire of the woman is to dominate her husband in contradistinction to the original plan of God. This desire to rule over her husband is the primary expression of the sin nature of the wife acted out in marriage. We're seeing it all the time today. And I understand the pressures upon a wife, especially if she's got a godless husband. The husband's sin nature is acted out in marriage by not providing gentle, godly, loving leadership. Now let's go to 1 Peter 3:7, because I know we're all looking forward to that. Let me just read it to you. Husbands, likewise, in the same way as you're to obey kings and rulers, those in authority over you, in the same way wives are supposed to submit to their husbands, husbands likewise in the same way dwell with your wives, cohabit with them, with understanding, with knowledge, giving honor to the wife, literally ascribing value to them, because that's what the Greek word for honor means. Ascribing value. When we honor God, we're admitting to Him how valuable He is, infinitely valuable. When we look at human life, and that's why most Christians are pro-life, because we give value to every life created in the image of God, because it's created in the image of God. Husbands likewise dwell with them, your wives, with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel. And now we come to a full stop for a moment. What's the weaker vessel? Literally, a vessel or container or object that has no strength. Why is she a weaker vessel? Well, let me just tell you a few things, and you can see where you want to go with this. I've looked at a few of the possible answers here. That a wife is not as bright as men. We know that's not true. They've got more sophisticated brains than we do, and I've covered that in other issues, in other videos. So let's let that rest for now. They've got different brains. They think in a different manner than we do, we men. But it's just as good a brain. It's just a different brain. Are they morally more culpable than men? Because Eve was deceived, led astray. Is it that? It's possible, but I don't think so. I think the issue is simply that they are weaker. And the problem is that they are weaker when men are sinful. Their weakness shows up through the sinfulness of men. Because of the sinfulness of men, women need to be protected by godly men. A father at first, and a husband later on. I'm willing to just admit that the weaker vessel, the wife, is strictly an issue of physical strength. On the average, a man possesses about 50% more brute strength than woman. 40% of a man's body weight, most men, is muscle. 23% of a woman's body weight is muscle. And as I mentioned last time, a woman has 20% fewer cells in her bloodstream than does a man. In other words, he will not fatigue and tire as quickly as she will. And I told you a story about factory workers during World War II. When they increased the number of hours in the workday from 10 to 12, the accident rate for women went up 150%, but it didn't change at all for the men. Why? Because the women were fatigued faster and just flat ran out of steam. And as a result, they had 150% more accidents than they had when they were back in a 10-hour work week. So men and women are just simply different. They're different in their body shape, in the shape and type of organs they have, their hormones, their blood supply, the lungs of women are smaller. All these things add up to say woman is specifically created for what God created them to be. And man was created to be the protector. Let's go back to this issue of submission. If a woman is to submit to her husband, according to 1 Peter 3:1, what does that really mean? It's to place yourself under. Let me tell you a story about when I was in the Army, back in the 60s. I achieved the rank of maggot. At least that's what I was constantly told. If a general or a lieutenant gave conflicting orders, as a maggot, I was supposed to obey the general because he outranks the lieutenant. My lieutenant in Vietnam was a 19-year-old 90-day wonder. He was 19. I was 21. I was one of the old men of our unit, by the way. Who would I follow? The general or the 90-day wonder? The 19-year-old lieutenant? Well, fortunately, they never conflicted, so I was never put to the test. But generals always outrank lieutenants. That's a fact of life. What about God and man? If the President of the United States says, do this, and God says, do that, what are you going to do? The godly man will do that. He'll do what God tells him to do and pay the consequences when he's abused by the man. And the fear throughout this passage, look at verse 2. It says, you'll win your husband by your chaste conduct, accompanied by fear. That's not fear of the husband, that's fear of God. It's throughout this passage. That's the implication. That's the impetus for us obeying these issues that were given in 1 Peter 3. So going back to 1 Peter 3:7, let's look at it once again. Husbands. Now, remember, there's no Greek word for husband. You add the article, it's called an arthrous noun. You add the article to the noun, and it changes it from man to husband, at least in our translation. Husbands, likewise, in the same manner as the wife obeys the husband or submits to his leadership, in the same manner as everybody obeys the king or the government, in that same manner dwell or cohabit with your wife with understanding, with knowledge. Gnosis is the Greek word. Giving honor to the wife. In other words, attributing value to her because God gave her value. As to the weaker vessel, she's physically weaker than you are. And if you look at the newspapers or you watch the news or you read the news on the internet, you'll realize that women are consistently abused by men. An epidemic. That men think they can have their way with women and nothing's going to be said. I was reading some statistics. A sociologist, I won't give the name, but a sociologist said there are 107 million women missing in the world. And that sociologist took that from the fact that statistically more women are born than men. And yet there are several countries in which the men outnumber the women by a considerable margin. Countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, China, those countries. What happened to those women? Well, money was not spent on them the women going to the hospital, or the girls, or the babies, or whatever. It was the boys and the men who were cared for. And as a result, in those countries, China particularly, there's, I think, 108 men for every 100 women. And that goes against the statistical probability in that country. So women are being made to disappear. And I don't know exactly all the details, but I know they don't get as good a health care in those countries as the men do. The girls don't get as good a health care as the boys do in those countries. So something's going on. They are not valued as the Bible says they're to be valued. So, giving honor to the wife, putting value, ascribing value to the wife as to the weaker vessel. In other words, men, you're supposed to pony up and protect your wife. And as being heirs together, joint heirs of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Whose prayers? Well, specifically in this verse, the men. So what are we going to do with the weaker vessel? Husbands are going to protect them. Fathers are going to protect their daughters. Why? because we have so many sinful men who are willing to abuse women and girls. That's why. I know we've kind of done a shotgun approach to this, and if you have questions, and I'll follow up with those questions, if you have questions, put them down below here in YouTube. And if you would, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And if you like this video, click the like button.